killer everyone trusted, a Hercule Poirot mystery. Chapter 1. The House Where Smiles Were Worn Like Masks. The village of Ashford Hollow sat in the Somerset countryside, like a painting that had grown too comfortable with itself. Hedgerows trimmed to military precision, stone walls draped in late autumn ivy, and a sky the colour of pewter that promised nothing so dramatic as a storm, yet refused entirely to offer sunshine. It was the sort of English village that appeared, at first glance, to be at perfect peace with the world. It was, as Hercule Poirot had observed on more than one occasion, precisely such places that harboured the deepest human ugliness. Whitmore Grange stood at the northern edge of the village, separated from the common lane by a half-mile of gravel drive lined with copper beech trees. The house itself was Georgian in bone, symmetrical, composed, and quietly imposing, with tall sash windows that caught the grey October light and gave back nothing of the interior. It had belonged to the Whitmore family for 3 generations, and now it belonged, by inheritance and marriage, to Mr. Gerald Whitmore, a man of 52, who had the handsome, slightly worn look of someone who had once been charming, and had never entirely forgiven the years for diminishing that fact. The occasion that had drawn guests to Whitmore Grange was, on the surface, a celebration. Gerald Whitmore had announced, by personal letter to a select circle of family and intimate associates, that he intended to formally present his revised last will and testament at a small gathering. The reading was scheduled for the coming Monday. The weekend, he had written in his fine, sloping hand, was to be one of good food, old friendship, and honest conversation. It was, Captain Arthur Hastings reflected as his taxi turned through the gates on that Friday afternoon, odd way to celebrate anything. Hastings had not been invited in any formal capacity. He had come at the request of Poirot himself, who had received a brief but unmistakably anxious note from Gerald Whitmore 3 days prior. The note had said only, "I find myself in a situation I cannot explain to the police, and which I dare not ignore. If you are at liberty, I should very much value your company this weekend. I am not yet certain there is a crime, but I am certain something is wrong." Poirot had read this note twice, folded it with great care into his breast pocket, and telephoned Hastings within the hour. The guests who had assembled by Friday evening represented what Gerald Whitmore evidently considered his inner world. There was Mrs. Dorothea Fenwick, Gerald's elder sister, a tall, angular woman of 58, with silver hair swept into an immaculate chignon and eyes of a pale, assessing blue that missed very little. She had been widowed 6 years prior, and had developed, in widowhood, a manner that was simultaneously gracious and faintly predatory. There was Dr. Elliot Marsh, Gerald's personal physician, and, by all appearances, closest friend, a broad-shouldered, ruddy-faced man of 45, whose professional warmth was so well practised it had become distinguishable from the genuine article. He laughed easily, drank moderately, and had a doctor's habit of watching people with clinical attention, while appearing to do nothing of the sort. There was Miss Cecily Oakes, Gerald's private secretary of 11 years, a precise, quiet woman of 39, who wore her competence like armour and her feelings, whatever they were, somewhere no one could easily find them. She had arrived with 2 leather briefcases and the composed expression of someone who expected to work through the weekend. There was Mr. Oliver Farrant, Gerald's nephew by marriage, the son of his late wife's younger brother, a handsome young man of 27, with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to being liked, and the slightly restless eyes of someone who found present moment perpetually insufficient. And there was Mrs. Nina Farrant, Oliver's mother, plump plump and pleasant woman of 55, who spoke warmly of everyone, remembered birthdays, and had, Hastings noticed, a very particular way of hosting conversations away from anything that might become uncomfortable. Gerald Whitmore himself met his guests in the drawing-room before dinner. He was gracious, attentive, and almost entirely convincing, only a man trained, as Poirot was, in the precise observation of human behaviour, would have noticed that Gerald's left hand, resting on the arm of his chair, was not quite still. The fingers moved, a slow, barely perceptible tapping, as though keeping time with some interior anxiety his face had been carefully instructed to conceal. Poirot noticed. He said nothing. Dinner was served at 7:30 in the panelled dining room, where the candlelight was warm and the conversation was careful. There was talk of the countryside, of a recent election, of a mutual acquaintance's ill-advised second marriage. There was laughter, correctly measured. There was wine, correctly poured. Beneath it all, Hastings felt, though he could not have said precisely why, the particular, unmistakable tension of people who are performing for one another, who have agreed without discussion to leave certain subjects undisturbed, who are each, in their private way, waiting. Later that evening, after the guests had retired, and the house had settled into its night-time creakings, Gerald Whitmore found Poirot alone in the small library off the hall. He closed the door behind him and stood for a moment, with his back to it, though he had arrived somewhere, and was not yet certain what to do with having arrived. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, "I am very glad you came. You were not certain I would. I was not certain you should." He moved to the window and looked out at the dark garden. "Brought these people here, under the pretence of friendship and a will reading. The will reading is genuine. The friendship," he paused, "friendship I am no longer entirely sure of. And what is it, Monsieur Whitmore, that you suspect?" Gerald turned from the window. In the lamplight, his face was older than it had appeared at dinner, the composure thinner. "I suspect," he said quietly, "that someone in this house has been systematically stealing from me. Not money, or not only money. Documents, private correspondence, records of certain business arrangements that were never intended for other eyes." He paused again, "And I suspect that when they learn what my new will contains, one of them will find that prospect entirely unacceptable." Poirot regarded him with those calm, observant eyes. "You believe, then, that you are in danger?" Gerald Whitmore looked at him for a long moment, and what crossed his face was not quite fear, and not quite certainty, but something that lived uncomfortably between the two. "I believe," he said, "that by Monday morning we shall both know considerably more than we do now." He was, as it transpired, entirely correct, though not in the way he had intended. By Sunday morning, Gerald Whitmore was dead. Chapter 2. Morning that changed the shape of everything. He was found at 7:45 on Sunday morning by Cecily Oakes, who had risen early, as was apparently her custom, to organise the documents required for Monday's will reading. Gerald's study was on the ground floor, adjacent to the library, and she had noticed as she passed that the door, which Gerald invariably kept closed, stood 3 inches ajar. She pushed it open. Gerald Whitmore was seated in his leather chair behind the large mahogany desk, in the attitude of a man who has fallen asleep over his papers. His head had dropped forward onto his chest. His right hand lay open on the desk beside a half-empty glass of whisky. His face, when Cecily, with the controlled efficiency of someone overriding their instincts through sheer force of professional habit, moved to look at it, held the curious, smoothed expression that death lends to faces that have spent long years in tension. She did not scream. She stood very still for approximately 4 seconds. then walked directly to the telephone in the hall and rang Dr. Marsh. Marsh arrived in his dressing gown within 3 minutes. He examined Gerald briefly, thoroughly, with a gravity that his professional composure did not entirely suppress. He then looked up at Cecily Oakes, stood in the doorway with her hands clasped and her face very pale, and said with quiet precision, "He's gone, I'm afraid. Sometime in the night, I should think. I'll need to telephone the police." "Is it his heart?" Cecily asked. Her voice was perfectly steady. He had a condition. He had a cardiac condition," Marsh said carefully. "Yes." He looked at the glass on the desk. He looked at the papers beneath Gerald's hand. He said nothing further for a moment. Then, "I'll telephone now." The household assembled in the drawing room by 8:30. Dorothea Fenwick sat rigidly upright in the wing-back chair nearest the fireplace, composure so absolute. It had the quality of deliberate construction. Oliver Farrant stood by the window with his hands in his dressing-gown pockets, looking out at the garden with the expression of someone trying very hard to look, like they were thinking about nothing in particular. Nina Farrant wept softly and continuously into a handkerchief, which she pressed to her lips whenever anyone looked at her directly. Psst. Hastings found Poirot in the study doorway. The Belgian stood with his hands clasped behind his back, examining the room with the methodical, unhurried attention of a man cataloguing an exhibition. His eyes moved from the desk to the whiskey glass, to the cold fireplace, to the window latch, to the arrangement of papers, to the single sheet that lay at a slight angle to the others, as though it had been replaced in haste. "Well, Poirot?" Hastings said quietly. "Heart failure, do you think?" I think," said Poirot without turning, "several things, none of which I am yet prepared to share." He moved into the room, bent slightly at the desk, and examined, without touching, the whiskey glass. He examined the papers. He looked at the slight indentation in the carpet on the far side of the desk, though a second chair had recently been drawn up close and then returned to its original position. He looked at the window. He looked at the inside of the door. "There is a key in this lock," he said. "Yes," said Hastings. "The door was found ajar, though. Indeed, the door was found ajar." Poirot straightened. "The door of a man who kept it invariably closed was found 3 inches open. The key was not turned, and yet a man who feared for his safety, who brought a detective to his home specifically because he feared for his safety. Such a man would lock his door before sleeping, would he not?" Hastings stared at him. Unless he didn't have time to lock it, or unless he was visited first, Poirot turned at last and looked at Hastings with those precise, unreadable eyes. "There is something else. Look at his right hand. Hastings, look at the position of it, open on the desk. A man who falls asleep naturally over his papers. His hand closes, or it slides. It does not lie flat and open, as though it has been placed." The local police, Inspector Cardwell and a young constable, arrived at 9:15. Cardwell was a sensible, slightly stolid man in his mid-40s who had handled 2 suspicious deaths in his career, and approached this one with the careful thoroughness of someone who did not wish to be wrong. He listened to Dr. Marsh's preliminary assessment. Cardiac arrest, consistent with Gerald's known condition, and to Poirot's quiet, courteous introduction of himself, and then he looked at the room with the expression of a man recalculating. "You believe it wasn't natural causes, Monsieur Poirot?" "I believe," Poirot said pleasantly, "that the case merits examination before that conclusion is reached. I believe Monsieur Whitmore himself believed he was in danger. I have his own words on the subject, spoken to me less than 12 hours before his death." He paused. "I also believe that if you send that whiskey glass for analysis, you will find it considerably more interesting than its appearance suggests." Cardwell looked at the glass. He looked at Poirot. He made the decision that would prove, over the next 48 hours, to have been entirely correct. "Right," he said. "No one leaves the house." The news passed through the drawing-room like a cold current. Dorothea Whitmore set down her teacup with a sound like a small, precise judgment. Oliver Farrand turned from the window. Nina Farrand's weeping paused for a beat, then resumed. Cecily Oakes looked at no one in particular, and in the quality of that studied neutrality Poirot found, quietly and without visible reaction, the first thread worth pulling. Chapter 3. Belgian, in a house full of secrets. Poirot's method of entering a household under investigation was not dramatic. He did not announce theories or flourish deductions. He moved through rooms as though he found them simply interesting, pausing at a bookshelf, admiring a painting, accepting a cup of tea with genuine pleasure, while absorbing, cataloguing, cross-referencing everything he observed with the silent efficiency of a very fine machine that happened to wear an excellently pressed suit. He spent the first 2 hours of Sunday morning in motion. He walked the ground floor corridors. He noted that the study's single window overlooked the rear garden and was latched from inside, but that the latch showed faint marks consistent, recent, careful handling. He noted that the fireplace held ash that was not last night's ash. It was older, compressed, a particular quality of papers burned, rather than wood. He noted that one of the 2 whiskey decanters on the study sideboard had been moved. The ring left by its base did not align with its current position, and the dust of several weeks was interrupted in a slight arc. He also noted Fost in the small downstairs cloakroom near the study, a pair of indoor shoes belonging, by size, by the faint scent of the particular rose-water talc she used, to Cecily Oakes. They had been placed very neatly by the umbrella stand. Indoor shoes are placed when someone has come in from outside and changed. The soles held traces of the gravel from the rear garden path. Cecily Oakes had been outside. She had returned. She had, with characteristic neatness, changed her shoes. She had then, some time later, gone to the study and found Gerald Whitmore dead. Or she had said that she had found him. Poirot filed this observation in the very particular cabinet of his mind, that he reserved for facts which were not yet facts, but which might, in time, prove to be. The formal interviews began after lunch. Cardwell conducted them in the dining room, Poirot seated slightly to one side as agreed. Present, quiet, and apparently engaged with nothing more pressing than the middle distance. Dorothea Fenwick was first. She sat with the composure of a woman who has rehearsed dignity until it has become genuine, and she answered every question with the precision of someone who has thought carefully about what they will and will not say. She had last seen Gerald at 10:15 the previous evening, in the drawing-room. They had spoken briefly about the will. She had gone to bed at 10:30. She had heard nothing in the night. "Your relationship with your brother," Poirot said pleasantly. Cardwell had finished. "It was a close one?" Dorothea looked at him. "We were fond of each other, and the will, the new will, one he intended to read tomorrow. You were aware of its contents?" A very slight pause. Gerald had mentioned, in general terms, what he intended. "In general terms," Poirot repeated with perfect courtesy. "I see. And these general terms, were they agreeable to you?" Dorothea Fenwick held his gaze, with the steadiness of someone who has been asked a sharp question and has decided to meet it with surface, smoothness. "Gerald's affairs were his own," she said. "I respected that." She left the room with the measured step of a woman who knew she was being watched and had chosen to give nothing away. Dr. Marsh was next. He settled into the dining chair with the ease of a man accustomed to being believed and answered. with the candour of someone who had calculated that candour was his best available strategy. He had last seen Gerald at 11 o'clock the previous evening, he said. Gerald had come to him, knocked on his bedroom door to request his prescription sleeping tablets. He had taken 2. Marsh had noted this, thought nothing of it. Gerald used them occasionally when anxious. And Gerald had been anxious this weekend. Poirot leaned forward almost imperceptibly. He came to your room at 11? Yes. And the tablets, you gave them from your medical bag? From the bottle I carry for patients when travelling, yes. How many tablets remained in the bottle? A fractional hesitation. I haven't counted them this morning. I could do so. Please, said Poirot gently. Do. Oliver Farrant was third, charming, and apparently transparent, and spoke with the energetic candour of someone keen to establish that they have nothing to hide, which, Poirot had long noted, was itself a form of concealment. He had spent the evening in the billiard-room, he said, from 9 o'clock until well past midnight. Alone, he admitted cheerfully, except for a good deal of whisky and a biography of Wellington he'd found on the shelf. He'd heard nothing. He'd gone to bed late. He'd slept soundly. You were fond of your uncle? Poirot asked. He wasn't technically my uncle. Oliver smiled. He was my mother's brother-in-law. But yes, we got on. And the will. You had expectations? Oliver's smile remained, but something behind it shifted, the way a landscape shifts when a cloud passes over it. Gerald was generous. He'd mentioned it. He shrugged. I'm not a man who counts on inheritances, Monsieur Poirot. Poirot smiled pleasantly and said nothing. The nothing was very eloquent. Nina Farrant cried throughout her interview, was gently handled by Cardwell, and provided almost no information of practical value, except one. She said through her handkerchief, seen a light in the study at what she believed was close to 1 o'clock in the morning. She had been unable to sleep. She had come downstairs for warm milk, and had seen the line of light under the study door. You did not knock? Cardwell asked. I didn't want to disturb him, she said. Gerald always worked late when he was anxious. I assumed he was. She stopped. I assumed he was alive, she finished quietly, and finally Cecily Oakes. She sat, as she did everything, with economy and precision. She had risen at 6:45. She had dressed, come downstairs, and gone to the kitchen for tea. At approximately 7:40, she had passed the study and noticed the open door. She had looked in. She had seen Gerald. She had telephoned Dr. Marsh. The shoes in the cloakroom, Poirot said when Cardwell had finished. His voice was mild and conversational. Your shoes, Miss Oakes. The indoor ones, placed by the umbrella stand. They had traces of garden gravel on the soles. Cecily looked at him without expression. I went outside briefly, before 6 o'clock. I sometimes walk early in the morning. Indeed, the rear garden path. Yes, and you did not pass the study on your way out or in? A pause. I used the side door, near the kitchen. I see. Poirot nodded pleasantly. Tell me, Miss Oakes. In 11 years of working closely with Monsieur Sir Whitmore, would you describe him as a man who trusted you completely? Something crossed her face. Not guilt, precisely, but its more complicated cousin. He trusted me with his professional affairs, she said carefully. But not, Poirot said with perfect gentleness, with everything. Cecily Oakes met his eyes for a long moment. Then she looked away, the first time she had broken eye contact in the entire interview. No, she said, not with everything. Chapter 4. What the dead man kept in his desk, Poirot requested, and Cardwell granted, permission to examine the study in full on Sunday afternoon. Hastings accompanied him. The body had been removed, the glass sent for analysis. Room stood in the particular stillness that descends upon a space from which a life has lately departed. Everything in its place. everything wrong. Poirot began at the desk. The papers beneath where Gerald's hand had rested were, in the main, financial documents. Quarterly statements, correspondence with a solicitor named Haverstock in Bristol, a sheaf of insurance policies. Poirot read each with the deliberate attention of a man who suspects that the obvious document is not necessarily the significant one. The significant one was the last in the pile. It was a letter, handwritten on plain paper, undated. The handwriting was Gerald's own, the same fine, sloping script as the note he had sent to Poirot. It read, "If you are reading this without my having shown it to you directly, then matters have gone further than I hoped. The sum transferred from the Ryland account in August was not authorised by me, for I have the original transfer documentation. I know who signed it. I have not yet decided what to do with this knowledge, but I intend to decide by Monday. I am writing this because I am afraid I will not have the opportunity to speak." There was no signature. There was no addressee. It was a note written by a man who knew he was in danger and was not entirely sure who to trust with the knowledge. "He wrote this for us," Hastings said quietly. "He wrote this for someone," Poirot agreed. "Someone he hoped would look, and look carefully." He moved to the filing cabinet to the left of the desk. A tall, steel-grey affair with 4 drawers. The top 2 were unlocked. The bottom 2 were locked. The locks on the bottom 2 showed fresh scratches around the keyhole, the precise, careful marks of a pick or a thin instrument used recently, and not for the first time. "Someone has been in these drawers," Poirot said. "Someone has been very careful about it, but not careful enough." In the second unlocked drawer, behind a folder of property documents, Poirot found a small leather notebook. He opened it and stood for some moments turning pages with gloved fingers. The notebook contained columns of figures, dates, and initials. The figures were substantial. The initials appeared in combinations EM, DF, CO, F. "The initials of the guests," Hastings said, looking over his shoulder. "The initials of the guests," Poirot agreed, each appearing beside a date and a sum. He studied the most recent entries. "Some of these sums, mon ami, are very considerable indeed." He closed the notebook and slipped it into his breast pocket. He then crossed to the fireplace and crouched, examining the ash. The ash was the remains of papers. Several sheets, burned recently enough that some of the edges held legible fragments. Poirot, with a small pair of tweezers produced from his pocket, extracted 3 fragments and held them to the light, portions of what appeared to be a legal document. On one fragment, in formal typeset, he could read the words, "Hereby revoke all previous testamentary dispositions." On another, the entirety of the estate and all associated holdings to the name that had followed was gone, consumed by the fire, leaving only, with the express exclusion of the new will, Hastings breathed, or a copy of it, Poirot said, or a draft. He stood, straightened and looked at the fireplace with an expression that on another face might have been called sorrow. Someone wished very much to ensure that the new will was never read aloud tomorrow morning, Hastings, and someone. He looked at the desk, the open door, the room in its composed, silent entirety, was given the opportunity last night to ensure exactly that. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "We must speak with the solicitor in Bristol. Haverstock. He will have the original, if he hasn't been contacted already." Poirot turned and looked at Hastings with an expression that combined approval of the observation with mild concern at its implication. "Precisément," he said softly, "if he has not already been contacted." He crossed to the telephone on the corner table, paused, and then, with the careful instinct of a man who has learned not to use a murdered man's telephone when the murderer may be listening, he turned and walked to the door. "We will use the call box in the village," he said. "Come, Hastings." Chapter 5. The Architecture of False Sympathy. The call box at the northern end of Ashford Hollow's single main street smelled of damp wool and old pennies, and the telephone within it connected Poirot to a very surprised junior clerk at Haverstock and Sons in Bristol, who confirmed, after considerable professional hesitation, that yes, a Mr. Gerald Whitmore had lodged a revised will with the firm approximately 3 weeks prior. The will was registered, sealed, and retained. No, it had not been removed. No, they had received no communication about it that morning. Poirot thanked him with considerable warmth and replaced the receiver. "The will exists," he told Hastings as they walked back up the lane. "It is safe. Whatever was burned in that fireplace was either a personal copy or a draft. Killer did not know, or did not take time to ascertain, that the original was held by a Bristol solicitor, so the motive for the murder, if it was murder, may not have been achieved. The will still stands. Whatever it contains, it will still be read." Poirot paused, hands in the pockets of his overcoat, and looked up at Whitmore Grange on its slight rise against the pewter sky. "Which means, mon ami, that our killer has committed a murder for a purpose they have not accomplished. That is a very uncomfortable position. It produces anxiety. Anxiety produces movement. Movement produces mistakes." He smiled with quiet satisfaction. "We must simply ensure we are watching when the movement occurs." Back at the house, the afternoon had settled into the particular purgatorial atmosphere of a country house in which someone has died and everyone is waiting to be told what to do next. Tea was served at 4 o'clock in the drawing-room by the housekeeper, Mrs. Pole, a small, stoic woman who had apparently concluded that tea was the only appropriate response to any situation, and was producing it with the mechanical dedication of someone keeping order through ritual. Poirot moved through the room, accepting his tea, admiring the arrangement of chrysanthemums in the window, and observing. Oliver Farrant was at the writing desk in the corner, composing what appeared to be a letter. His hand moved steadily, but his eyes, when he looked up to consider a word, did not have the expression of a man writing to a friend. They had the careful, calculating focus of a man running sums. Dorothea Fenwick had positioned herself near the fire. With a novel she was not reading, she turned pages at regular intervals that had nothing to do with the pace of reading. Twice she glanced at the door to the hall. The glance, each time, had the quality of an assessment rather than a reflex. Nina Farrant sat beside Poirot on the settee and spoke at some length about Gerald's qualities, his generosity, his patience, his loyalty to those he loved. She spoke warmly and at length, and beneath the warmth Poirot perceived the quiet certainty of a man who has listened to a great many people tell him what they wanted him to believe, the careful architecture of misdirection. "He was so good to Oliver," she said, "truly like a father." Oliver's own father was, well, Gerald always said that Oliver could rely on him. Always. And the will Monsieur Oliver relied upon inheriting. Nina's expression flickered. Gerald always said. She stopped, began again. "Oliver has had certain financial difficulties. As young men do, Gerald was aware, and always said it would be resolved." "In the new will?" Poirot asked pleasantly. Nina looked at her tea. "I don't know the specifics." "Naturally," said Poirot. It was Dr. Marsh who provided that afternoon the most instructive performance. He came to Poirot in the small library before dinner, sought him out, which was itself significant, and sat with the ease and directness of a man who has decided that the best defence is an extremely confident offence. "I want to be straightforward with you, Monsieur Poirot," he said. "I know you're looking at all of us, and I understand why. I want to tell you something that I perhaps should have mentioned this morning. Poirot inclined his head. Gerald came to me on Friday evening, before dinner, privately, and told me he believed someone in the house had been forging his signature on financial documents. He didn't tell me who he suspected, but he was afraid. He asked me, as his friend and his doctor, to keep an eye out, to tell him if I observed anything. Marsh paused. I want you to know that because I believe you will find it out anyway, and I would rather you had it from me. Poirot regarded him with warm, steady attention. That was wise of you, Doctor. I cared about Gerald. Yes, said Poirot. I can see that you did. He paused. The sleeping tablets you provided him Friday evening. You have counted the bottle? Marsh met his eyes. 14 tablets remaining. The bottle holds 20. I dispensed 2 to Gerald on Friday, as I told you. That accounts for the count. It accounts precisely, Poirot agreed pleasantly. Tell me, is the bottle in your medical bag currently? Pause so brief that only a man of Poirot's calibrated attention would have noted it. Yes, you have not at any point since Friday, the bag. To give Gerald the tablets. Nothing else. I see, said Poirot. He smiled. Thank you, Doctor. You have been most helpful. After Marsh had gone, Hastings leaned forward. Do you believe him? Poirot turned his cups slowly in its saucer, regarding the small rotation with the air of a man watching something much larger move. I believe, he said carefully, that Doctor Marsh is a man of considerable intelligence who has told us several true things and one very important lie, and who has done so in the precise ratio calculated to make him appear honest. He set the cup down. That, my dear Hastings, far more interesting thing than an obvious liar. Chapter 6. The geometry of a locked cabinet Monday arrived with thin rain and an atmosphere in the house that had compressed overnight into something close to intolerable. Cardwell had confirmed late on Sunday evening. The analysis of the whisky glass had detected a sedative compound, consistent with the class of sleeping tablets prescribed in Marsh's bag, in a quantity sufficient to cause profound unconsciousness and cardiac suppression in a man with Gerald Whitmore's existing heart condition. It was, in the careful language of the police surgeon's preliminary report, consistent with administration. It was murder. Cardwell made this announcement to the assembled household at 9 o'clock Monday morning, with the measured gravity of a man delivering information that changes the nature of everything. The drawing-room received it in silence. Nina Farrant's hand went to her mouth. Oliver's face performed an expression of shock, with the faint delay of a man whose internal state is running a fraction of a second behind his social instincts. Dorothea Whitmore sat very still and pressed her lips together. Cecily Oakes looked at the fireplace. Marsh looked at Poirot. Poirot looked at no one in particular, and therefore at everyone. The will, Cardwell said, as lodged with Haverstock and Sons in Bristol, will be read this morning as originally scheduled. I have spoken with the solicitor who is travelling this morning. In the meantime, I must ask you all to remain available. Haverstock, a thin, careful man of 60 in a good raincoat, arrived at 11 o'clock and settled himself, at the dining table, with his documents and the composed manner of a professional who has read wills in difficult rooms before and expects to do so again. The beneficiaries, as the will revealed, were as follows: the entirety of the Whitmore estate, the house, the investments, the not inconsiderable personal assets, was left to a charitable foundation Gerald had established 2 years previously for the support of rural medical services. Personal bequests were made to Mrs. Pole, the housekeeper, and to 3 other long-time staff members. Cecily Oakes received a substantial sum in recognition of her service, and Oliver Farrant received nothing. Not nothing in the sense of a reduced legacy. Nothing in the explicit sense. He was mentioned by name in a clause of exclusion. The previous will, Haverstock explained to her carefully, had left a significant portion to Oliver. The revision, dated 6 weeks ago, removed him entirely. The silence that followed this was the kind that has physical weight. Oliver's face had gone very still, not shocked. The performance of shock had dissolved, leaving behind something older and colder. He looked, for just a moment, exactly like what he was. Poirot watched him with the quiet attention of a man reading a very straightforward text. Dorothea's composed face had also registered something. Not grief, but a rapid, private recalculation. The estate had not come to her, whatever she had expected. Whatever Gerald had told her, in general terms, had not come to pass. She sat very straight and said nothing, and the nothing was loud. After the reading, Poirot returned to the study. He stood before the filing cabinet and looked at the locked lower drawers with the expression of a man who has been given a piece of a puzzle, and is deciding whether the piece is the shape he was told. He took from his pocket the small leather notebook, initialed, dated, figured, and opened it to the most recent page. The last entry was dated 3 weeks ago. The same week Gerald had revised his will. The initials were OF. The sum was £11,000, and beside it, in Gerald's cramped, careful notation, were 2 words, forged transfer. Poirot closed the notebook. He then did something Hastings, watching from the doorway, found initially puzzling. He crouched before the lower locked drawers, and studied not the locks but the floor before them. Carpet showed the impression of a foot. The edge of a shoe, to be precise, the outer toe edge of a shoe slightly larger than average, leaving its trace in the pile in the way that a person leaves a mark when they crouch and shift their weight forward. He found the same impression faintly before the fireplace. The same shoe. The same person had opened, or attempted to open, the lower drawers, and had also crouched at the fireplace, burning something. Poirot stood and looked at the window. He looked at the door. He stood very still with the particular quality of a man in whom a great deal is occurring very quietly. "Hastings," he said at last, without turning. "Yes, Poirot." "When you were at Sandhurst, your military training, you learned, I imagine, something about the loading and use of sleeping compounds in the field." Hastings blinked. "Well, yes. There were lectures on chemical agents, sedatives used in—" He stopped. "Why on earth are you asking about Sandhurst?" "I am not asking about Sandhurst," Poirot said, confirming something about the method. He turned. "A man who wished to administer a sedative to another man's whisky would need to ensure the target drank from the correct glass. He would need to remain in the study long enough to observe this, and he would need to leave before death occurred, or remain and ensure the outcome more directly." He paused. The open hand Hastings placed. The door left 3 inches ajar. Not locked, as it should have been, because the last person in the room was not Monsieur Whitmore. He was already unconscious when his hand was arranged. The door was left ajar, not by carelessness, but because the killer needed to be able to hear if anyone came down the corridor. Hastings felt the familiar cold certainty of standing at the point where a mystery stops being abstract. "You know who it is," he said. I know who it must be," Poirot said, with the careful precision of a man who does not claim more than the evidence grants. "There are 2 things I still need. One is a particular detail about a medical bag. The other," he glanced at the initials in the notebook, "is a conversation I have not yet had." He snapped the notebook closed. "I will have them both this afternoon." Chapter 7. Threads of Silk and threads of Gilt Poirot's conversation with Cecily Oakes took place in the small morning room on the east side of the house at 2 o'clock on Monday afternoon. He had asked for it quietly, without involving Cardwell, and she had come without visible reluctance. The composure of a woman who has decided upon a course and intends to hold it. She sat across from him at the small table by the window. The rain had lightened to a mist. The garden beyond the glass was very still. "You were in love with him," Poirot said. He said it gently, and without preamble, because Poirot had found over many years that the gentle, direct approach caused less armour to rise than the oblique one. Cecily was quiet for a moment. Then, the economy of someone releasing a weight they have carried for a very long time. "Yes." "For how long?" "6 years, perhaps longer." She looked at the garden. He didn't know. Or if he knew, he chose not to acknowledge it, which was kinder. "And when he revised the will, you knew what it contained?" "He told me yes. He trusted me with the documents." She paused. "He excluded Oliver." He explained why. The forged transfer. Oliver had forged Gerald's signature on a transfer of £11,000 3 months ago from the Ryland account. Gerald discovered it quietly, said nothing publicly, and rewrote the will. "You knew this and said nothing to us." "I was waiting." She looked at Poirot directly. "I knew something was wrong. I knew before he died that something was wrong. I went outside at 5:30 Sunday morning because I couldn't sleep, because I was afraid. When I came back in—" She stopped. "The door was already ajar," Poirot said softly. "I saw the light under the door. I should have gone in immediately, if I had." She pressed her lips together. "I went back to my room. I told myself it was nothing. I came back at 7:40 and found him. You chose not to mention this early observation to the police. I was afraid of what it implied. About who had been in the study." She looked at him. "I thought if I said nothing, if the death was ruled natural, you would protect someone." A long silence. "I thought Oliver had done it," she said at last, "and I thought—" She stopped. "I thought Gerald would not have wanted the scandal." Poirot regarded her with great compassion, and no softness whatsoever. "Miss Oakes," he said, "who has several errors of moral judgment this weekend, all of them born from a genuine love of a good man. I will not compound your situation by pressing you further, but I must ask you one more thing, and you must answer me honestly." "Yes, papers burned in the fireplace. You know what they were." She nodded. Gerald had made a private copy of the revised will. He kept it in the study, in the locked lower drawer. The key to those drawers was on his keychain. She paused. Keychain was not on his body this morning. Poirot sat very still. The key to the lower drawers, the drawers that showed pick marks, had not been picked at all. It had been taken from the body after death. He stood, thanked Cecily Oakes with a warmth that was entirely genuine, went to find Cardwell. The keychain, when the inventory of Gerald's personal effects was examined, Cardwell's list from Sunday morning, was present. Keys to the Grange, to his motor car, to his London flat. But the small brass key that Poirot had noticed in the notebook's description as belonging to the lower filing drawers was absent. Someone had removed it. After Gerald had lost consciousness, or after he was dead. Someone who had been in the study between 1 o'clock, when Nina Farrant had seen the light, and 7:40, when Cecily Oakes had reported the body. Poirot now had his timeline. He had his method. He had his motive, immaculately preserved in the pages of a small leather notebook. He needed only to assemble them before the right audience. He found Hastings in the billiard room, and sat with precise deliberateness in the exact chair Oliver Farrant had claimed to have occupied all Friday evening. "There is a copy of Wellington," he said, looking at the shelf of books against the near wall. "But it is on the 3rd shelf, Hastings. The 3rd shelf is thick with dust, entirely undisturbed." If Monsieur Ferrand spent several hours on Friday evening reading Wellington, he did not take the book from this shelf. He stood, clasped his hands behind his back, and looked at the room. He was not here. He was elsewhere. In the study, I think, during Friday evening, searching. He did not find what he wanted on Friday. He tried again on Sunday night. He turned, this time. He was more thorough. Hastings looked at him. "You're going to call them all together." "This evening," Poirot said. "Dinner, all of them." And then he permitted himself a small, precise smile. "Then we shall see who cannot hold their hands still." Chapter 8. When the mask slips sideways. The dinner that Monday evening was Poirot's design, though it wore the shape of a simple meal. He had asked Mrs. Poll to set the table for 6, all the guests, himself and Hastings, and to serve at 8, and to ensure there was good wine, he had asked Cardwell to be present, but not at the table. The inspector had agreed, somewhat puzzled, to station himself in the hall with his constable. The conversation at dinner moved in the careful, watchful patterns of people who know they are being observed, and have each made a private decision about what to show. Oliver Farrant was charming and voluble, talking of the will reading with a practised lightness that aimed for philosophical acceptance, and landed consistently a half-inch short. Dorothea Fenwick ate with controlled appetite, and contributed to the conversation with the minimum social coinage required. Nina Farrant attempted warmth and produced, instead, an impression of someone inflating a balloon with a very small leak. Marsh talked easily. About wine, about Somerset, about a patient he'd been following who had made an unexpected recovery, and watched Poirot from corner of his eye throughout. Cecily Oake said almost nothing. She ate. She looked at her hands. She looked once at Oliver Farrant, the expression of a person who has decided to allow a process to complete itself. It was over the cheese course that Poirot set the table differently. "I have been thinking," he said pleasantly, to no one in particular, about the particular difficulty of concealing guilt in a house this size. The table's quality of silence altered. "A large house," he continued, "might offer genuine concealment, servants, corridors, multiple entrances. A house of this size, with a party this small, every footstep is heard, every light under a door is noticed." He reached for his wine. Madame Farrant saw a light in the study at 1 o'clock. It is an interesting time for a recently deceased man to have his lights on. Nina Farrant made a small sound. "What are you suggesting, Monsieur Poirot?" Oliver said. His voice was still pleasant. The charm was wearing very thin over something much less pleasant beneath. "I am suggesting nothing," Poirot said. "I am observing. The light at 1 o'clock tells us that someone was in the study after Monsieur Whitmore was already unconscious. Someone who needed time to search the drawers, to find the key, to burn the private copy of the will, to replace the keychain with one key missing." He paused. "Someone who was very careful about all of it, and very nearly successful." Oliver's hand, resting on the table, had become very still. "The notebook," Poirot said, "is interesting. It records sums and initials. The final entry, £11,000 3 weeks ago, beside the initials OF, with the notation, forged transfer, Ps. He looked at Oliver Farrant with the mild, regretful expression of a man who has been following a river and has arrived, as expected, at the sea. "That is a notation in your uncle's hand, Monsieur Farrand. An uncle who discovered 3 weeks ago that you had forged his signature and transferred £11,000 from his account. This is," Oliver stood. "This is outrageous. Please sit down," Poirot said pleasantly. "I have not finished." Oliver sat. The motion had the quality of a controlled fall. "Monsieur Whitmore discovered the forgery. He rewrote the will, removing you entirely. He also, I believe, gave you a private opportunity to account for yourself. He was, by all accounts, a man of some decency, and you used that opportunity to come to his study on Sunday night, administer the sedative you had taken from Dr. Marsh's bag on Saturday afternoon, when Marsh left the bag briefly in the drawing-room. And to wait in the study, in the chair drawn up near the desk. The impression is still in the carpet. Until Monsieur Whitmore was sufficiently unconscious, and then to ensure, by the addition of a second dosage directly, that his cardiac condition would do the work for you. You arranged his hand, you took the key, you burned the copy of the will, you left the door ajar. Poirot's voice was steady and even and completely without heat. Then you went to bed. The table was absolutely silent. Oliver Farrant looked at Poirot across the candles with an expression that had passed through several stages very rapidly and had arrived, finally, at something that was almost a relief. The expression of a man whose performance has ended and who has not quite decided whether to be furious or grateful. "You can't prove the sedative came from Marsh's bag," he said. His voice had changed entirely. Quieter, older, stripped of charm. "I cannot prove it in this room," Poirot agreed. "I leave that to the laboratory. But I note that you do not deny the forgery. I note that you do not deny the argument with your uncle, which Cecily Oakes overheard on Friday evening, and was attempting, out of misplaced loyalty to Monsieur Whitmore's reputation, to conceal. I note that the Book of Wellington on the billiard-room shelf has not been touched in weeks." He looked at Oliver steadily. "And I note, Monsieur Farrant, that, of all the people in this house, you are the only one whose alibi is both solitary and entirely fictional." Oliver Farrant closed his eyes. When he opened them, the charm was entirely gone. What remained was younger and more frightened and considerably more real. "He was going to ruin me," he said. His voice was flat. "Not just the money. He was going to tell my employers. The bank. He had a letter drafted." He looked at the table. "I would have had nothing. And so," Poirot said quietly, "you chose to ensure he had nothing instead." The door from the hall opened. Cardwell entered. Behind him, the constable. Oliver Farrant did not look up. Chapter 9. The Architecture of Trust Betrayed. After Oliver Farrant had been taken, quietly, without the drama of handcuffs in the dining room, a small mercy Cardwell extended with professional discretion. The house entered a new silence. It was different from the silence of suspense that had occupied the wee weekend. This was the silence of after, things having resolved into their true shapes, of the particular exhaustion that follows the lifting of sustained pretense. Nina Farrant had not spoken. She had sat throughout Oliver's arrest, with her handkerchief pressed to her mouth and her eyes fixed on the middle distance with the expression of a woman watching a version of the world she had carefully constructed collapse, with the slow, inevitable logic of bad architecture. Poirot, who was not without compassion for mothers, sat beside her. For some time after, the others had quietly departed the dining room. Hastings remained, standing near the window, tactfully engaged with the middle distance. "You knew," Poirot said, not as an accusation. Nina Farrant made a small, compressed sound. "Not what he had done," she said. "Not the murder. I want to be clear. Not that." She pressed the handkerchief harder. "But I knew about the money. He came to me in September, after Gerald had confronted him. He told me there had been, he described it as a misunderstanding about a transfer. He asked me to help smooth things over with Gerald." She stopped. "I spoke to Gerald. Gerald told me the truth, that it was a forgery. He was considering legal action. I begged him not to. I told him Oliver would pay it back." Her voice broke cleanly, as a bone breaks. "Gerald said he would consider it, and then he said—" She stopped again. "He said that his revised will would speak for itself. Poirot supplied gently. Yes. A long silence. I thought that meant Oliver would simply receive less. I thought Gerald was protecting himself going forward. Not. She looked up. I didn't know he'd excluded Oliver entirely. I didn't tell Oliver. He must have found out somehow. He found out, Poirot said, because Mademoiselle Oakes inadvertently confirmed it to him on Saturday afternoon, when he pressed her about the will's contents. She gave nothing away directly, but the evasion itself. He paused. Monsieur Farrant was a perceptive young man in certain ways. Nina Farrant looked at him. Her face held the particular, desolate expression of a woman who has spent many years wilfully not seeing certain things about her son, and is now being required to see all of them, once. He was always impatient, she said softly. Even as a small boy, he couldn't wait for things, couldn't tolerate the idea of something being withheld. She folded the handkerchief with methodical, unconscious neatness, thought it was youthful energy. I thought he would grow into something better. Poirot said nothing. There was nothing to say that would be both honest and kind, and Poirot, when forced to choose between them, had long preferred silence. Later, in the library, Dorothea Fenwick presented herself to Poirot with the stiff formality of a woman making a confession she finds distasteful but necessary. "I should tell you," she said, "that I knew about the Ryland account transfer before this weekend. Gerald told me in September. He asked my opinion on whether to pursue legal action or handle it privately." She paused. "I advised him to handle it privately. I thought the scandal of a prosecution would be worse than the loss." "A reasonable position," Poirot said. "It was self-interested," she said flatly. "Host. I have shares in 2 of Gerald's investment vehicles. A scandal would have affected their value." She met his eyes with the directness of a woman who has decided to dispense with illusion. I am not a sentimental person, Monsieur Poirot. I am honest about my motives. But I want to be clear. I did not know what Oliver intended. If I had, I would have come to you, whatever the cost." Poirot regarded her for a moment. "I believe you, Madame Fenwick." She nodded, once, with the precision of a woman accepting a verdict. "Will you stay on at Whitmore Grange?" Poirot asked. "The estate passes to Gerald's charitable foundation," she said. "That was his decision, and it was his right." She paused. "I shall go back to Bath on Tuesday. I have a life there." She stood, smoothed her skirt, looked at Poirot with those pale, clear eyes. "He was the only person who knew me well enough to be genuinely annoying," she said. "I shall miss him considerably." She left the room without another word. Marsh came to Poirot last, and came, Poirot noted, voluntarily. Sent. He sat in the armchair across from Poirot, and looked at him with the steady, tired eyes of a man who has been carrying something for a while, and has decided to set it down. "My bag," he said. "The tablet count. Yes. I told you there were 14 on Sunday morning. I counted again this afternoon." He paused. "There are 13. 1 tablet is unaccounted for." He looked at the fire. "The first count was wrong. I was under some stress when I counted. I should have been more careful." Poirot looked at him steadily. "You were not careless, Doctor. You were afraid. You understood, as a medical man, exactly what the sedative in the glass implied, and exactly where the source might be. And you chose, I think, a mixture of self-protection and genuine uncertainty, to give the wrong count initially." Marsh was quiet. "It was not admirable," Poirot said, "but it was human." He paused. "The correct count and your honest revision of it be of considerable assistance to the prosecution's case." Marsh nodded. He looked, Poirot thought, considerably older than he had at Friday's dinner. The ruddy, easy warmth had receded, leaving behind something quieter and less comfortable, and perhaps for that more genuine. "He was my closest friend," he said. "I know," said Poirot, I should have seen it. What Oliver was, Gerald. Marsh stopped. Gerald saw it, and I missed it. Monsieur Whitmore saw it because it was his money, Poirot said gently. You missed it because it was not. We are always clearer about the crimes committed against ourselves than the crimes committed before our eyes. Chapter 10. Every thread accounted. For Poirot assembled his full reconstruction for Cardwell on Tuesday morning, the day the guests would leave. He did it at the dining table, with coffee, in the methodical, ordered fashion that was as close to genuine pleasure as he permitted himself in professional life. The structure of the crime, as Poirot laid it out, was as follows. Oliver Farrant had, in July of the current year, discovered that his uncle's investment account held a sum temporarily consolidated, preparation for a transfer to a new vehicle. The paperwork was complex, the authorizations numerous. Oliver had access to the account details through his mother's financial relationship with Gerald. He had obtained, through means that the bank records would confirm, a blank transfer form and had forged Gerald's signature, transferring £11,000 to a subsidiary account he controlled. He had done so believing the complexity of Gerald's finances would obscure the loss for some time. Gerald had discovered it within 6 weeks through the meticulous attention of Cecily Oakes, who had noticed a discrepancy in the quarterly statement and brought it to Gerald's attention without knowing its origin. Gerald had investigated, confirmed the forgery, confronted Oliver in private, received, to his considerable disappointment, not contrition but a request for silence and time to replace the funds. Gerald, being a man of fundamental decency, had given Oliver a period of grace. He had simultaneously, and with great care, revised his will and placed the private copy in the locked lower drawer. He had also, Poirot had deduced from the note found among his papers, begun to suspect that Oliver would not be content to wait. Gerald's invitation of Poirot was the act of a man who understood his own situation with clarity, and was attempting to ensure that, if the worst occurred, there would be someone present who would see it. On Saturday afternoon, Oliver had taken his opportunity. Marsh had left his medical bag in the drawing-room when called briefly to the telephone. Oliver had accessed the bag, removed 2 tablets, enough added to the existing 2 Gerald had taken willingly on Friday night, to understand the pharmacological calculation he was making. A man of Gerald's cardiac condition, heavily sedated, was a man whose heart could be relied upon to do the work. Sunday evening, Oliver had knocked on Gerald's study door, or had found it unlocked, which Gerald would have left it for a trusted family member, and had introduced the sedative to Gerald's whiskey while the man was distracted with papers. He had sat in the second chair, waited. He had arranged Gerald's hand. He had taken the key from the keychain. He had opened the lower drawers, removed the private copy of the will, and burned it in the fireplace. He had then returned the key to the chain, replaced the chain, imperfectly, in the dark, failing to replace the small brass key he'd already pocketed, and left the room, pulling the door to 3 inches to hear any approaching footstep. He had then gone to bed. He had arranged his expression and his alibi. He had been very nearly perfectly composed. He made 3 errors, Poirot told Cardwell. First was the arrangement of the hand, a small theatrical touch born from a novel or a film, entirely inconsistent with natural death, and immediately suggestive to a trained eye. The second was the Wellington biography, a claimed alibi supported by an undisturbed book. The third, and most critical, was the keychain. He took the key. He forgot to replace it. A man who is meticulous enough to arrange the hand and burn the will is nevertheless a young man in a state, controlled terror, and terror makes the mind miss small things. Cardwell looked at his notes, and the tablet taken from the bag. We'll have the glass confirmed. The analysis will confirm the compound. Marsh's honest revision of the tablet count will confirm the source. Oliver has made no serious attempt at denial. His final statement at dinner, which Hastings and yourself witnessed, is already of considerable evidential value. Cardwell sat back. The solicitor confirms the will stands. The Foundation gets everything. As Monsieur Whitmore intended, Poirot finished his coffee with quiet satisfaction. The killer, I am afraid, did not accomplish what he set out to do. He murdered a man for an inheritance he will never receive. Cardwell was quiet for a moment. Nasty business, he said. All murders are nasty, Poirot said simply. Some are more so than others. This one has the particular nastiness of betrayal by the genuinely trusted. He stood, straightened his jacket with habitual precision. Monsieur Whitmore trusted Oliver Farrant. He gave him grace when he should have given him the police. He invited him to his house when he should have had him arrested. He paused. He was, perhaps, too decent a man for the world he occupied. "Isn't that always the way?" said Cardwell, not as a question. "Regrettably," said Poirot, "it is often the way. The decent men trust. The ones who would betray them know this and wait." Chapter 11. Small Things That Carry. Great weight. There remained one conversation that Poirot had deliberately reserved. Not for its evidential value, which was minimal, but for a reason he would have found difficult to articulate without sounding, as Hastings sometimes suggested, uncharacteristically philosophical. He found Cecily Oakes in the study. She was standing by the desk, looking at it the way one looks at the place where something important used to be. Without quite knowing what to do with the space, she had a coat on. Her 2 leather briefcases were by the door. She had apparently been about to leave and had stopped here on the way. "Miss Oakes," Poirot said. She turned. Her composure was entirely intact, but it had the quality, now, something load-bearing. The composure of a person keeping themselves together through pure structural determination. "I wanted to tell you," Poirot said, "that it was your note-keeping that first alerted Monsieur Whitmore to the discrepancy. The quarterly statement, he mentioned it to me on Friday evening, that the discovery had come through a member of staff he trusted implicitly." He paused. "It was you, precision, your attention. They were the beginning of the chain that led here." Cecily looked at him for a moment, without speaking. "I didn't know what I'd found," she said. Not at first, but you brought it to him, even when you might have assumed it was a simple error and let it pass." He looked at her steadily. That required a certain moral clarity. He was a good employer. She paused. He was a good man. "Yes," said Poirot. "He was." She picked up her briefcases. At the door she stopped. "Bequest," she said. "In the will, it was more than I expected." "He knew your value," Poirot said simply. She nodded, the same economical, load-bearing nod, and left. Poirot stood alone in the study for a while. He stood at the desk and looked at the space where Gerald Whitmore had arranged his papers each evening, had sat with his anxieties and his decencies, had written a careful note to a Belgian detective on the chance that things went wrong. He had known something was wrong. He had tried to arm himself with the right person. He had not quite been quick enough. This was, Poirot reflected, permanent sorrow at the centre of his profession. He arrived after. He assembled the truth and delivered it with precision, and he was honest about this, with a certain satisfaction in the craft of it. But he could not arrive before. He could not stand between the decent man and the trusted killer. He could only come after, and count the threads and name the hand that pulled them. He straightened the edge of the desk blotter. He aligned the pen that had been left slightly diagonal. He looked at the room once more, and then, the small, precise motions of a man who respects a space he is leaving, he turned off the lamp and went to find Hastings. Chapter 12. Turn of the Normal World. The taxi that carried Poirot and Hastings away from Whitmore Grange on Tuesday afternoon moved down the copper beach, drive at a steady pace, the rain having clarified overnight into a thin, cold brightness that gave the landscape a clean, used quality, as though the countryside had been recently washed and was not yet certain what to do with itself. Hastings, who had been quiet for some miles in the contemplative way of a man processing an experience, turned eventually to Poirot. "Part I keep coming back to," he said, "is that Oliver Farrant sat at that dinner table on Friday evening and smiled and talked about Wellington, looked everyone in the eye." "People who intend harm," Poirot said, looking at the passing fields, "are not generally the people who cannot look others in the eye. The people who cannot look others in the eye are feeling guilt. The people who intend harm have, in their own private logic, justified themselves." Oliver had convinced himself, I think, that Gerald was being unreasonably punitive, that the forgery was borrowing rather than theft, that to lose an inheritance he had already spent in his mind was an injustice visited upon him rather than a justice applied. He paused. "It is a very common mechanism, mon ami. The human capacity for self-justification is, in Poirot's experience, almost without limit." "You didn't seem surprised," Hastings said. When it pointed to Oliver, "You seemed, almost from the beginning." "I was not certain," Poirot said precisely. "I had a direction. There is a difference. The little grey cells do not produce certainty from observation. They produce direction. You follow the direction, accumulate the evidence, and certainty follows from that." He turned slightly in his seat. "What told me the direction, at the very beginning, was the open hand. Everyone else had a theory about the body that was consistent with a sudden event. Surprise, shock, natural death. The open hand was inconsistent with all of those. It was the gesture of someone who had arranged a scene, and a scene is arranged only by someone who was present to arrange it. And the only person present when Gerald Whitmore died was the person who brought about his death. Simple when you put it like that." "In retrospect, all solved crimes are simple," Poirot said with slight asperity. "That is what makes them so satisfying and so misleading as a guide to the future. Each crime presents its simplicity only after the solution. Before, he spread his small gloved hands in a brief, expressive gesture. Before, it is always chaos with a pattern hidden inside it." Hastings was quiet for a moment. "And Gerald, do you think, if you'd arrived a day earlier—" "I arrived when I was called," Poirot said. Voice was even. "I arrived when he was ready to call me. He called me on Wednesday. The murder was Sunday. Had he called me earlier, had he trusted his own fear more readily? Perhaps." He was quiet. "But I do not examine the cases I might have prevented, Hastings. I can only examine the cases I have. Otherwise—" he paused. "Otherwise there is no end to the grief of it." The taxi turned onto the main road south. The Grange disappeared behind the beeches. The Somerset countryside opened up, wide and quiet, in the thin afternoon light. Hastings watched Poirot's profile. The immaculate moustache, the precise features, the expression of a man who is thinking and has decided not to share what he is thinking, and felt, not for the first time, that there were entire rooms in Hercule Poirot that no one was ever invited into. "You liked him," Hastings said. "Gerald Whitmore, I could tell." Poirot was quiet for a long moment. "He was a man," he said finally, "who tried to be decent in circumstances that rewarded indecency. He gave grace when the law would have given him retribution. He tried to keep private what could have been public, to settle fairly what could have been settled harshly." He paused. "He was not without fault. He was perhaps naively trusting, but in the balance. Poirot looked at the road ahead. In the balance, he was a man worth the trouble of avenging. Chapter 13, Grey Cells and the Weight of Justice. It was 2 weeks later, in the flat in Whitehaven Mansions, Poirot permitted himself the full and private reconstruction of the case. Not for Cardwell, not for Hastings, not for the eventual proceedings at which Oliver Farrant would stand but for himself. He sat in his chair by the window, with a cup of tisane cooling on the table beside him, and he laid out in his mind, as neatly as he laid out anything, which was with absolute precision, the architecture of what had happened and what it revealed about the nature of trust and its exploitation. Gerald Whitmore had built his world on a particular assumption. The people he gathered close were, in their essential natures, honest. He had chosen a doctor for a friend, a meticulous woman for a secretary, a nephew by marriage for a partial heir, a sister for an intimate. He had, in each case, selected for competence and apparent integrity. He had been correct in every case but one. But the one, as it always was, had been sufficient. Great irony of the case. And Poirot appreciated irony with the quiet pleasure of a connoisseur, was that Oliver Farrant had been, in all external respects, the most immediately appealing member of the household. He was handsome, sociable, evidently well liked by everyone including Gerald himself. He was the one most readily imagined as the bright, easy young man at a house party. He was the one a novelist might have cast as the romantic lead, and never considered for the role of murderer. And yet the little grey cells, which cared nothing for appearance, had pointed at him almost from the beginning, because it was not the charming who were innocent. It was the desperate who were dangerous. And Oliver Farrant, beneath the charm, had been desperate. Desperate for money, for security, for the inherited safety that Gerald Whitmore represented, and that Gerald Whitmore had, complete justice, decided to remove. The desperation had been invisible to those who loved him. His mother had chosen to see youthful energy where others saw impatience. Gerald himself, who had chosen to see potential where others might have seen appetite. They had trusted because they cared. Their care had made them blind. Poirot thought about Cecily Oakes, who had cared more quietly and more clearly than anyone, and who had seen the discrepancy in the accounts with the undeceived precision of a woman who brought her intellect, not her heart, professional duties. She had not trusted less than the others. She had simply not allowed her trust to override her attention. He thought about Marsh, whose lie about the tablet count had been small and human and ultimately corrected. A man who had tried to protect himself from an implication he feared, and who had lacked the final moral courage to prevent Oliver Farrant from using that hesitation against Gerald. Prost! Marsh would have to live with that, which was a sufficient penalty. The courts would not touch him. He thought about Dorothea Fenwick, who had been honest about being self-interested, and who was, therefore, paradoxically, more trustworthy than she appeared. Self-interest, clearly named, was a known quantity. Self-interest masked as affection was not. He thought about Nina Farrant, who had loved a son she had not seen clearly, and who would spend the rest of her life living with the particular, devastating question that such mothers must endure. What did I overlook, and when did I choose to overlook it? These were not, Poirot thought, the questions of a criminal case. They were the questions that the criminal case opened beneath itself, in the deeper terrain, of how people chose to live with one another, and what they owed each other in honesty. Gerald Whitmore had owed Oliver Farrant Arcant nothing beyond what decency required, and decency had killed him. That was not an argument against decency. It was an argument as it was always an argument for clarity, for seeing the person in front of you, not the person you wished them to be. The tisane had gone cold. Poirot looked at it with slight displeasure, set it aside, and considered ringing for Georges. On the table, beside the tisane, was a letter from Haverstock and Sons in Bristol, confirming that the charitable foundation, Datchin established by Gerald Whitmore, would receive the entirety of the Grange estate, and that the foundation's first grants had already been designated for rural medical facilities in Somerset. The letter was formal and precise and contained at its close a single line added by Haverstock himself. Mr. Whitmore would have been very pleased. Poirot read this line twice. He folded the letter neatly into thirds. He placed it in the drawer of his small side table, in the section he reserved for correspondence of a particular kind. Not professional, not personal, but somewhere in the thin and important territory between. He rang for Georges. He ordered a fresh tisane. He thought for a moment. Gerald Whitmore's open hand on the desk, placed just so by the person he had trusted most unwisely, and then he turned his mind, deliberate precision, to the matter of whether the evening concert at the Wigmore Hall was worth attending. It was. He had, after all, earned it. Chapter 14. The last word, and the first silence. After it, Hastings came to Whitehaven Mansions on the Thursday of the third week after Whitmore Grange, bringing with him a copy of the evening paper that carried, on page 6, a brief report of Oliver Farrant's committal proceedings. The charge was murder. The evidence was described as substantial. A trial date had been set for the spring. He found Poirot in his customary chair, in a condition of unusual stillness, not reading, not engaged with anything visible, simply sitting with the composed immobility of a man whose mind is in full and private operation. "The paper," Hastings said, setting it on the table. Poirot glanced at it. "I have read it. They'll convict him, without a doubt. Physical evidence is conclusive, and his statement at dinner was poorly chosen." Poirot paused. "He is a young man who has spent his life relying on charm as a substitute for judgment. He believed, even at the last, that he could manage the situation. He could not manage the situation. He managed only his own undoing." Hastings sat in his usual chair. Charitable foundations been announced. There was a piece in the Somerset papers. Gerald Whitmore's legacy, medical services across the county. Yes. Something moved briefly across Poirot's face. Not satisfaction exactly, but its quieter cousin. He will do more good dead than Oliver Farrant would have done alive with 11,000 of his pounds. Hastings was quiet for a moment. "Do you ever wonder," he said, "whether any of it makes a difference? We solve the case, but Gerald's still dead." Poirot looked at him for a long, considering moment. "There are two answers to that," he said. "The first is practical. Yes, it makes a difference. Oliver Farrant would have killed again, or stolen again, or forged again, if he had succeeded and been unsuspected. The removal of one destructive person from society is a concrete good, not merely a symbolic one." He paused. "The second answer is less practical, and perhaps more important. Gerald Whitmore wrote that note to me because he believed that truth mattered. He believed that if something was wrong, it should be named, and named precisely, and made visible. He did not write to me for revenge. He wrote because he understood that in a world where crimes are permitted to pass unnamed, the Gerald Whitmores of the world, the decent ones, the trusting ones, are simply targets." He looked at the window. The autumn had deepened in the 3 weeks since Somerset. London wore it in the cold clarity of the air and the golden residue of leaves in the gutters. "I cannot bring him back," he said. "No one can, but I can ensure that the person who ended him does not walk freely into the next Gerald Whitmore's house. I can ensure that the record shows precisely and without equivocation, what was done and by whom. He looked at Hastings. Justice is not restoration, mon ami. It is not the undoing of harm. It is the refusal to pretend the harm did not occur. Hastings considered this for a while. "That's rather good," he said. Poirot regarded him with the faint, dignified exasperation of a man accustomed to having his better observations treated as marginally more impressive than expected. "It is not good," he said. "It is simply true." They sat in companionable quiet for a while, the city moving outside the windows in its ordinary oblivious way, full of its private dramas and its private deceits, and Hercule Poirot sat very still at the centre of it, his moustaches immaculate, his mind already moving, slowly, precisely, without haste, toward the next thing that would require him. He was, after all, a man with very particular grey cells. He found it a waste not to use them. The end